In the post-war interrogations of the German general staff conducted between 1945 and 1947, a question recurs across multiple transcripts, phrased in slightly different ways by different officers, and never answered to the satisfaction of the men asking it. The question concerns the American tank replacement rate during the campaign in Northwest Europe between June 1944 and May 1945. The German officers, reviewing what they had observed of the American advance from the hedgerow country to the Elbe, could not reconcile the tank losses they had inflicted with the American divisions that kept appearing in front of them, intact and fully equipped, the following week. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, interrogated in early 1946 by the American Intelligence Bulletin, returned repeatedly to what he called air power, air power, air power, naming it 3 times in the space of a single answer. He was correct that Allied air power had been decisive. He was also, it would later become clear, pointing at the wrong mechanism. The thing the German general staff could not see from where they were standing and could not reconstruct from the prisoner interrogations and battlefield reports available to them was that the American logistical system behind the tanks they were destroying was not replacing the tanks at the rate German generals assumed replacement was possible. It was replacing them faster than that. The specific figure that would later emerge from the after-action reports of the 3rd Armored Division, published in 1998 by the division's former assistant maintenance officer Belton Y. Cooper, indicates what the German general staff was trying to understand. The division entered combat in Normandy on June 29, 1944, with 232 M4 Sherman medium tanks on its authorized strength. Between then and May 1945, the division had 648 Shermans destroyed in combat beyond recovery. It also had approximately 700 more Shermans knocked out of action and subsequently repaired and returned to the line. Those two figures add up to 1,348 tank losses against an authorized strength of 232. The division had, across the campaign, lost its tanks roughly 5.5 times over. It had never gone below operational strength for more than a few days at a time. It had never stopped advancing. The 3rd Armored was one of 2 heavy American armored divisions in the European theater, the other being the 2nd, and both were organized around a larger tank complement than the nominally standard pattern that applied to the other 14 American armored divisions. The 3rd had been activated at Camp Beauregard, Louisiana in 1941, trained in California and Virginia and England, and landed in Normandy on Utah Beach between June 23rd and 25th, 1944, commanded by Major General Leroy Watson and organized into 3 combat commands that operated semi-independently. Its nickname, Spearhead, derived from its role as the lead armored element of the U.S. First Army for most of the campaign. When the division broke out of the Normandy bocage at Marigny on July 28, 1944, as part of Operation Cobra, it had already lost a significant fraction of the tanks it had landed with. The hedgerow fighting of late June and early July had exposed the Sherman's basic tactical problem in a way that Normandy made inescapable. The Sherman's 75mm main gun fired a shell that could not penetrate the frontal armor of a German Panther at normal combat ranges. The German Panther and Tiger tanks could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 3,000 yards. The Sherman was more maneuverable, more reliable, and significantly more numerous, but in a head-on engagement on flat ground, it lost. The maintenance officers of the 3rd Armored's Ordnance Battalion, including Cooper, who was 26 years old at the time of the landing, were responsible for recovering the knocked-out tanks, determining whether they were repairable, and either sending them back to the maintenance depots or, in the cases where the damage was beyond divisional repair capacity, writing them off and requisitioning replacements. Cooper was one of a small number of officers whose job required him to travel alone in a jeep between the forward elements of the division and the trailing supply columns, carrying loss reports that were considered too sensitive to transmit by radio. He estimated after the war that he traveled approximately 400 miles per week in this capacity through areas of partial or contested German control, delivering paperwork that determined what the division's next day tank strength would be. The tanks themselves came from a chain that Cooper could describe in outline, but that extended well beyond his operational view. Sherman tanks were manufactured at 11 different plants across the United States, principally the Detroit Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, which had been built in 1941 specifically to produce tanks, and which by 1944 was producing between 700 and 800 M4s per month. Total American Sherman production across the war reached approximately 49,000 tanks. Of these, approximately 19,000 were delivered to the European theater. The rest went to the Pacific, to the Mediterranean, to Lend-Lease shipments to the British, Canadians, French, Soviets, and other Allied forces, and to the training establishments in the United States. The tanks were moved from the factories to the East Coast ports by rail, loaded onto merchant ships, convoyed across the Atlantic to the British ports at Liverpool and Southampton, and from there either stored in the British ordnance depots or shipped across the Channel to the supply depots in Normandy, and later in Belgium and France. The Communications Zone Organization, under Major General John C. H. Lee, which managed this flow for the U.S. Army in Europe, employed at its peak in 1945 approximately 662,000 personnel in functions that included port operations, railway management, motor transport, supply depot administration, and the specific ordnance depots that received replacement tanks from the ports and issued them forward to the combat divisions. The German generals could not see any of this. They could see the tanks that arrived in front of them. They could count the hulks their anti-tank gunners produced. They could, from prisoner interrogations and from the markings on destroyed vehicles, reconstruct which American divisions they were fighting and roughly how many tanks those divisions had committed. What they could not see was the pipeline behind the divisions, which was what was producing the result they were trying to explain. The result, stated at the operational level, was that American armored divisions did not suffer material exhaustion during the Northwest Europe campaign. They suffered personnel exhaustion, fuel shortages during the logistical crisis of September and October 1944, when the supply lines ran from the Normandy beaches all the way to the Dutch border and could not keep up with the advance and the normal attrition of a 9-month campaign. What they did not suffer was the specific failure mode that German commanders had been trained during the interwar years to expect from an armored opponent, which was the depletion of the tank fleet to a point at which the division could no longer function. That failure mode did not occur. This was not because the Americans were not losing tanks. They were losing tanks at a rate that would have destroyed any German panzer division operating under similar conditions, and that in fact did destroy every German panzer division that operated under similar conditions. It was because the replacement system behind the American divisions was running at a capacity the Germans could not imagine. When a 3rd Armored Division platoon lost 3 of its 5 tanks in a single engagement with a single German Panther, which happened with some frequency, the division's ordnance battalion recovered the hulks, evaluated them overnight, and in most cases replaced them by the following morning with tanks drawn from the V Corps Ordnance Depot, which had drawn them from the Army Ordnance Depot, which had drawn them from the Communications Zone Depot at Isigny, or later at Liège. The paperwork for this flow was extensive. The paperwork was what Cooper spent most of his war doing. The sensitivity of the paperwork and the reason it could not be transmitted by radio was that the loss rates it contained would have been, if intercepted and correctly interpreted, a useful piece of intelligence to the Germans about which American units were combat effective on a given morning. The paperwork was delivered by hand in jeeps driven by officers like Cooper through ground that was not always controlled by either side, at speeds that reflected both the urgency of the reports and the presence of German stragglers in the back areas. At the German end of the same transaction, the Panzer Division that had destroyed 3 Shermans had, in most cases, taken losses of its own. Those losses were not being replaced at anything close to the rate the Americans were replacing theirs. German tank production, which peaked at approximately 1,929 tanks per month in July 1944, then declined steadily as Allied strategic bombing progressively destroyed the German tank manufacturing plants and the ball bearing and fuel industries that supported them. By January 1945, German monthly tank production was under half its July 1944 peak. The 6th Panzer Army that attempted the Ardennes counteroffensive in December 1944 did so with tanks that had been scraped together from across the entire Reich and with fuel reserves that would not support the mission beyond its first week. When the counteroffensive failed, the Wehrmacht had no strategic armored reserve left to commit. The American divisions facing the Ardennes counteroffensive, after it was contained and reversed, were back at authorized tank strength within 60 days. 68 merchant ships carrying replacement ordnance were dispatched from the United States in January and February 1945. The ordnance was unloaded at Antwerp, which had become operational as a supply port on November 28, 1944, after the Royal Navy and the Canadian Army cleared the Scheldt estuary of German mines and defenders. Antwerp, once operational, could handle approximately 40,000 tons of cargo per day, enough to sustain the American and British armies through the Rhine crossings and the final advance into Germany. What the German General Staff could not explain from the position they occupied was how this had been done. The German military tradition, which had produced the operational victories of 1939, 1940, and 1941, had been built on the premise that a smaller, better trained, better led, and tactically superior force could defeat a larger, slower-moving opponent by speed, concentration, and the exploitation of the opponent's errors. This premise had worked against the Poles, the French, the British Expeditionary Force, and for the first 18 months, the Soviets. It had not worked against the Americans in Northwest Europe, and the General Staff, interrogated after the war, kept returning to the question of why. Rundstedt said air power. Model and Kluge, who would not be interrogated because both killed themselves before the end of the war, had left behind no detailed assessment. Bayerlein, who commanded Panzer Lehr Division and whose formation had been destroyed at St. Lo in July 1944 by a single Allied carpet bombing, said the combined weight of air power and artillery. Sepp Dietrich, who had commanded the 6th Panzer Army during the Ardennes, said fuel. Hasso von Manteuffel, who had commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the same operation, said industrial capacity, but he said it without specificity and without understanding what the word covered at the American end of the line. None of them used the word maintenance, or the word ordnance, or named Detroit, or the communication zone, or the depots at Isigny or Liège, or the ordnance battalions that recovered the hulks and evaluated them overnight. The men who drove the jeeps, the welders at the depots, the longshoremen at Antwerp, and the railway battalion at Cherbourg that rebuilt the French rail network under German sabotage and Allied strategic bombing damage during the fall of 1944 went likewise unmentioned. These things were not named because they were not seen. From where the German General Staff was sitting, looking at the American advance from the business end, the logistical apparatus behind that advance was not visible. What was visible was the result. The result did not correspond to any military category the German General Staff had been trained to analyze. What they were looking at, without the vocabulary to describe it, was a kind of war that their own military tradition had not prepared them to fight. It was not a war of maneuver in the classical sense. It was a war in which maneuver was supported by a supply apparatus so large and so productive that maneuver could be sustained even under catastrophic material losses. The American divisions were not winning the tactical engagements. They were often losing them. What they were winning was the transaction that came after the engagement, in which the broken equipment was replaced faster than the other side could replace theirs. Cooper, writing about his own work in 1998, described it in ordinary procedural terms. He had recovered tanks, filed reports, and driven jeeps through areas where he might have been killed. The work had included scraping the remains of American crewmen out of the hulls of recovered Shermans so the hulls could be refurbished and put back into service. Watching his friends die had been part of the routine. He had not thought of himself, at the time, as a decisive figure in the campaign. The historians who went back through the after-action records of the 3rd Armored Division in the 1980s and 1990s, including Stephen Ambrose and Russell Weigley, concluded that men like Cooper had been more decisive than the combat officers whose names were on the post-war monuments. Cooper, when he was asked about this, said he was not a hero and should not be described as one. He said that the heroes were the tank crews who had died in the hulls he had later recovered. He said this in interviews for the remainder of his life until his death in 2007 at the age of 89. The numbers that describe what the German General Staff could not explain are available in the records of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps, the Communications Zone after-action reports, and the division-level histories of the armored units that fought the European campaign. The 3rd Armored Division lost 1,348 Shermans across the Northwest Europe campaign and kept advancing. The 2nd Armored Division, which operated under similar conditions through the same campaign, recorded losses of a similar order and kept advancing. The remaining 14 American armored divisions, operating on lighter tables of organization, recorded losses in proportion. Total American tank losses in the European theater between June 1944 and May 1945 are estimated at approximately 6,000 Shermans destroyed beyond recovery, with an additional figure of similar magnitude for tanks damaged, repaired, and returned to service. The American industrial plant produced, during the same period, approximately 11,000 Shermans for the European theater. The production figure exceeded the loss figure by a margin that allowed the theater to be simultaneously sustained in combat and reinforced in strength through the end of the war. German tank production across the same period totaled approximately 8,500 vehicles of all types on all fronts. German tank losses on all fronts across the same period were approximately 14,000. The German armored force was absorbing losses at roughly double its production rate from the middle of 1944 onward, and therefore declining in strength through the entire period of the American advance, during exactly the months in which the American armored force was maintaining strength through catastrophic losses. The German General Staff, in its post-war interrogations, did not refer to these numbers. The numbers were not yet fully available to them in the form in which the American archives would later publish them. What they referred to was their own inability to explain what they had seen. Rundstedt said air power. The 3rd Armored Division, during the same period in which Rundstedt was looking for an explanation, replaced its tank fleet 5.5 times and reached the Elbe.